time now to take a look at what's grabbing headlines in the press. And Solange Mougin is also with us in the studio. Solange, you're starting off with the latest reactions to the unrest in Brazil.
Yeah, the Brazilian press is focusing today on the aftermath of the ransacking of government buildings and how President Lula has promised that justice will be done. As we see on the front page of the Folha de Sao Paulo, far-right protesters have been hauled off. They are awaiting bookings in gymnasiums, as we see on the front page. Meanwhile, O Estado de Sao Paulo, it says that the Justice Ministry has identified individuals who financially backed the far-right push, and they've come from some 10 different states across Brazil. As the Washington Post notes, the Lula administration actually knew of the risk of these protests, but was reassured that it would not be necessary to boost security. Now, an investigation is ongoing into whether this new administration was intentionally misled, but the damage nonetheless has been done. As Libération notes on its front page, it writes that Brazil's democracy is in a fragile state, warning that this could happen in any democracy. It writes that Brazil is entering into a dangerous chapter with Lula. He must weed out, the paper says in a full-page spread, he must weed out the extremists. There are also calls for Jair Bolsonaro to be held accountable. He is currently in Florida and in a hospital since yesterday. Now, the White House is facing pressure to extradite the former president back to Brazil to face charges.
Yeah, he said he plans to go back. We'll see if he makes good on that promise. And meanwhile, Solange, cartoonists are continuing to draw parallels between Jair Bolsonaro and Donald Trump.
Yeah, as we see in the cartoon by Morton Moreland for the London Times, the two former presidents, well, they're carbon copies of each other as they watch television, but Trump is a little bit wider. Following with this theme of XXL, Coco's cartoon for Libération, it's Donald Trump's comb-over that manages to throw a brick at a ballot box. Meanwhile, Bolsonaro, he struggles with his much shorter comb-over to be able to hit that ballot box. Now, on this Trumpian theme of bigger is better, we have Ann Telnies of the Washington Post. Her drawing has Trump watching television, and in regard to thousands of supporters going into Brasilia, he says, "My crowds were bigger."
You know, Bolsonaro's looked bigger to me, but I guess you wouldn't convince Trump of that. Turning to news in France here now, Solange, it's a big day for the Macron administration, as Charles was just telling us in business.
Yeah, and as Les Echos tells us as well, that Matignon is announcing its pension reforms today, and it is a divisive issue as much as it was in the first attempt in 2019. Now, currently, two-thirds, according to L'Opinion, two-thirds of French people are against the reforms. At the same time, though, many have mixed feelings, the paper says. So it predicts that the level of protest is not going to be what it was in 2019. On its front page, you have a drawing by CAC where you have Macron asking one of the main questions, as we discussed earlier in business, what should be considered difficult working conditions to be able to retire earlier. And a Frenchman says, work. Work itself. Since moving the retirement age remains largely unpopular, and since there is rising discontent, as Politico tells us, this is a make or break moment for Macron, with the fate of the reform in the streets and in Parliament potentially dictating the trajectory of the rest of his term.
All right, next, Solange, another story that's getting a lot of ink here in France, hunting laws.
Yeah, Le Figaro tells us that the government has unveiled 14 measures, such as drinking limits, safety courses, and a tracking app to make hunting safer. But the main ask was for a one day of the week to be hunt-free, so walkers and bikers could roam without the noise and the fear of being shot or stuck in traps. But Mediapart explains to us that the government rejected this quiet Sunday ask, and whether it was because of strong unions, also a fear potentially of annoying hunters just before the pension reform push, or other reasons, the paper says that the proposed half measures have created much ire among environmentalists, joggers, walkers, and bike riders.
And next, Solange, you have some positive news for once for us about the environment.
Yeah, this is a major achievement, says Le Monde. The ozone layer is back on track to a full recovery. The ban of certain chemicals in the 1980s means that the protective layer of the ozone, as The Guardian tells us, and this layer helps prevent climate change, protect against climate change, and also prevent things like skin cancer. Well, it could be fully healed in most of the world by 2040.
Very good news. And finally, Solange, a surprising closure has been announced in the food world.
Yeah, Noma, which is ranked the top restaurant in the world, has decided to close its doors as a restaurant and become a food lab. Now, its Danish chef, René Redzepi, he told the New York Times that the grueling hours and the intense work culture are unsustainable. Now, the story could end there as a sort of wake-up call about fine dining restaurant culture. But since the Noma announcement, Vulture tells us that many are wondering whether Hollywood had anything to do with this decision, with recent mentions of Noma in films like Tar with Kate Blanchett, or perhaps it was the horror film The Menu. Up Rocks, it's a pop culture site, goes through tweets of people saying that it's The Menu, which was just released and which exposes the dark side of fine dining, that finally pushed the Copenhagen restaurant to throw in the towel. All of this sounds a bit like a chicken before the egg pop culture debate, but nonetheless, there is something rotten in the state.
Definitely intrigues me to watch both of those movies. Solange Moujane, thank you very much for that press review.